Hi, everybody. Tonight, we begin a journey through time, a gentle unraveling of the untold burdens, quiet struggles, and silent resilience of women who lived in the medieval world. In this soft and slow tale, we will follow the footsteps of women whose voices were seldom heard, whose stories rarely made it to the parchment of monks or the songs of bards. But tonight, through candlelit halls and mist-laden meadows, we will listen. This is not merely a recount of pain, but a story of endurance. It is a weaving of humanity, one thread at a time. And so let us dim the lights of the present and open the doors to the past, with hearts wide open and minds gently at rest. Our story begins in the year of our Lord 1247, in a village named Alderwick, nestled between the soft, undulating hills of Wessex. The hedgerows were thick with bramble and bloom, and the early summer air hummed with the sound of bees. Thatched cottages dotted the landscape, their chimney smoke rising like whispers toward the heavens. Beneath this calm veneer, however, lay a rhythm far less forgiving. In one such cottage, at the edge of the forest where the nightingales sang, lived a girl named Ellen. She was 14 winters old, her hair the color of late wheat, and her eyes, wide, wondering things, held the last glimmers of a childhood soon to vanish. Each morning before the sun was fully risen, she walked barefoot across the dew-kissed grass to fetch water from the stream. The clay jug pressed against her hip as she returned, her arms aching from the weight. Her mother, Maud, was already at the hearth, stoking the fire with practiced hands. There was no time for idle thought. Pottage to stir, flax to spin, wool to card, and bread to knead, all by midday, before the Lord's steward came down the road to collect the tithe. Maud had once been a girl like Ellen, soft of cheek and quick of smile, but the years had folded her into themselves like worn parchment. The curve of her spine bore the memory of many births, many losses, and many days spent hunched beneath the burden of duty. That morning, the village women gathered in the common field. It was weeding time, and even the babes were bundled nearby, their cries swallowed by the wind. Ellen moved beside them, her hands small and deft, tugging at the stubborn roots of thistle and dock. Among the women was Alice, the Reeve's wife, whose voice could carry across the moor when she was displeased. Alice spoke often of virtue, of the place of women beneath both God and husband. She was not unkind, but hers was a love braided with fear. "Mind ye never speak out," she whispered to Ellen, "or you'll be called more than unruly." Ellen listened. In the evenings, by the firelight, she practiced silence. She watched how her mother's lips pressed tight when her father returned from the alehouse, smelling of barley and pride. She noticed the flinch when voices rose. She learned that to be still was safer. But silence, though it shielded, also shackled. At church, the priest's voice echoed through the nave, reminding all of Eve's folly and the need for womanly obedience. Ellen knelt beside her mother, head bowed, heart puzzled. Was there no joy in being a daughter of Eve? No song, no dance, no laughter without price. The summer wore on. The manor lord's household held a feast for the feast day of St. Mildred, and word spread that the noble family was seeking young girls to serve in the great house. A position in the manor was seen as a step above the tilling of fields. Yet for many, it meant a different kind of servitude, softer in its silks, perhaps, but harsher in its silences. Ellen's name was chosen. Her mother did not cry, but her hands trembled as she packed her daughter's belongings, a shift of coarse linen, a small wooden comb, and a ribbon dyed with elderberries. She kissed Ellen's brow and whispered, "Do as you're told, my dove. Don't let them see too much of your heart." The manor was vast, with walls of cold stone and windows like slits in a helmet. The lady of the house, Dame Isolde, was tall and pale, her words clipped like thread. Ellen was placed under the supervision of Geetha, an older servant whose face bore the wear of decades. "You'll scrub, girl," she said, "and you'll learn to keep your eyes low. There's no room for dreaming here." Ellen's days became a series of silent rituals, sweeping, washing, fetching, bowing. The hours blurred into one another, broken only by the scolding of a misstep or the brief grace of a shared crust of bread. At night, she lay on a straw mattress in the servants' quarters, the stone floor stealing the warmth from her bones. She missed the sound of her mother's spinning wheel, the way her younger brother would hum as he carved little wooden animals. But the most brutal wound of all was not physical. It was the unraveling of self. In the manor, Ellen ceased to be a child. She was not yet a woman, yet her body was watched for signs of ripening. The steward's eyes lingered too long. The kitchen boys whispered and laughed. She was taught to fear what her body might become, for it could be taken, used, and blamed upon her. When her courses came, Geetha gave her a rag and little else. There was no celebration, no gentle guidance, only a sharp word and a harsher lesson. You are now meat for men's eyes, girl. Walk careful. And so, we leave Ellen here, in the shadows of the manor, her dreams slowly stitched into the hems of her rough shift, her voice folded away like a letter never sent. The weight of her world presses down, yet in her silence she watches. She learns. She remembers. And tomorrow night, we shall follow her further. The days at the manor turned long and dim, as though time itself had settled into a sigh too heavy to lift. Each dawn came draped in chill, seeping through the stone walls and into the marrow of Ellen's bones. The hearths were kindled early, and the scullery girls shuffled about like pale moths, whispering complaints too low for the steward to hear. Ellen had begun to understand the language of labor, the aching silence, the quiet glances, the unseen camaraderie born of shared exhaustion. Her hands had grown raw, fingertips cracked from lie and scrubbing. She had learned to rise before the first bell and move with the swiftness of steam vanishing from a kettle. In the manor, there was always something to be done, and never quite enough rest between. Yet it was not the labor that wore her thin. It was the weight of always being watched, judged not only by the noble family, but by the house itself. Dame Isolde was not cruel in the manner of blows or screams, but her gaze held a blade. A crooked stitch, a soiled hem, an uneven pour of wine, all met with a frost that sank beneath the skin. A girl must be a mirror, she once said to Ellen, her voice sharp as the crystal goblet she held, smooth, silent, and clean. Ellen remembered those words as she knelt to clean the base of a tapestry, the woven knights and maidens above her seeming more alive than she felt. Each thread held stories of glory, of noble quests and valor, yet Ellen's own tale was woven in dust and restraint. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the western hills and cast the manor in molten gold, a visitor arrived. Sir Alaric of Charnwood, a cousin of the lord, brought with him a small retinue and a scent of horses, leather, and power. He was a man of perhaps 30 winters, with a neatly trimmed beard, and a voice that rang through the halls like a bell tolling over a still lake. The manor buzzed with his presence. The servants whispered his name behind cupped hands. Some said he had fought in the northern campaigns. Others claimed he was recently widowed and now seeking a new match. Whatever the truth, he walked the corridors with the assuredness of a man who had never needed to ask twice. On the third evening of his stay, a feast was held. Ellen, tasked with pouring wine and attending to the lower table, moved carefully among the guests. Her feet ached, but her expression was blank, just as Geetha had taught her. "Never let them see your mind," the older woman would mutter, "for they will take it from you." As she bent to refill a goblet near the high table, she felt eyes on her. Not the casual glance of the idol, but the pressing gaze of possession. Sir Alaric was watching her. His lips curled, not in cruelty, but in a smile too knowing for her comfort. Ellen's heart, once so steady in its practiced rhythm of survival, gave a startled flutter. She moved away quickly, but not quickly enough. That night, Geetha caught her by the elbow and pulled her into the shadows of the pantry. "Did he speak to you?" she demanded, eyes sharp beneath her graying brow. Ellen shook her head, but Geetha did not release her arm. "Then listen to me well, girl. If he does, you bow, you nod, and you vanish. Do not linger. Do not meet his eyes." "Why?" Ellen whispered, her voice barely a breath. "Because men like him," Geetha replied, voice low and bitter. "Think of girls like you as seasonings to be tasted. Not wives, not daughters, just warmth for a night and forgetfulness by morning." That warning clung to Ellen like the smell of the lye tubs. She avoided the upper halls when she could, kept to the kitchens, the gardens, the storerooms. But one cannot hide forever in a place where every breath is counted. A week later, she was called to the solar. Dame Isolde's voice, firm and measured, summoned her by name. She entered the chamber with slow steps, heart hammering. The lady sat by the window, embroidering lilies onto a swath of velvet. Her needle danced with a precision Ellen both admired and feared. "You have drawn notice," Dame Isolde said, eyes never leaving her work. Ellen bowed her head. "Forgive me, my lady. I said you drew notice, not displeasure. Sir Alaric has expressed interest in speaking with you." Ellen's stomach turned. "I am but a servant, my lady." "Indeed," the woman replied, her tone unreadable, "and in your station to be spoken to is a privilege." There was no room to refuse. That evening, she was led to the garden where lanterns flickered among the hedgerows. Sir Alaric stood beneath a pear tree, his cloak drawn about his shoulders, the scent of wine upon his breath. He greeted her with charm, asked her name though he already knew it, spoke of stars and poetry as though she were some courtly maiden. Ellen answered with care, her voice small, her limbs tense. She did not want to anger him. She had seen what happened to the kitchen girl who once slapped a knight's hand, banished without coin, without shelter, her name never spoken again. Alaric did not touch her that night, but he made clear his intention. "You've a beauty in you," he said, brushing a lock of hair from her face. "Not like the ladies of court. Real beauty, like rain on stone." She wanted to vanish. She wanted to be back in her mother's cottage, listening to the crackle of the hearth and the turning of the spindle. When she returned to the servants' quarters, Geetha was waiting. Ellen did not speak, but Geetha knew. She held out a small cloth bundle, a charm of rowan and ash. "Keep this under your pillow," she said, "and pray he finds another distraction." Ellen did as she was told, but prayers were not always heard in places such as these. And so we close the second chapter of Ellen's tale, with the shadow of danger slowly lengthening across her days. The manor walls stood tall, but they did not shelter. They only kept the silence in. The charm of rowan and ash, tied with a thin thread of red wool, nestled beneath Ellen's pillow like a fragile shield against the encroaching dark. Night after night, she lay still, breath shallow, listening to the creaks and murmurs of the old stone manor. Wind pressed against the shutters, whispering in tongues long forgotten, while the rats in the walls scratched and scurried as if echoing her thoughts. Restless, hunted, small. Geetha had given the charm not out of superstition, but out of a weary kind of hope. In this place, even small protections carried weight, even if their power was only in the comfort they offered. Ellen clutched that comfort like a child clings to the last light of dusk, wishing it would not fade. But charms cannot hold back fate, and prayers cannot muffle the footsteps of men. Sir Alaric remained at the manor far longer than anticipated. His business with the Lord, a matter of lands and debts, stretched from days into weeks. Each evening, his presence lingered in the hall like the scent of spiced wine, thick and cloying. Ellen kept to corners, always moving, always quiet, her eyes never meeting his. Yet still he found ways to speak to her. He did not threaten, not with words, but he spoke to her as though her will were already given, her body already his to claim. He called her sweeting, dove, little flame. Once, when she served him at table, he brushed her wrist with the back of his fingers, and the cold that followed that touch seeped into her bones for hours. Geetha watched from afar. The older woman had seen too much over the years. She had once served a lady herself, in a household long crumbled into ruin. Her silence now was not cowardice. It was armor, forged through decades of surviving in a world that listened only when it chose to punish. One gray morning, while Ellen scrubbed the great hearth, Geetha knelt beside her and whispered low, "He means to take you. Not ask, take. If he calls you to his chamber, you must be gone before the candle burns low." "But where would I go?" Ellen asked, her voice hollow. "There is a woman in the forest," Geetha murmured. "Old, near blind, lives in a hut with no lord and no master. Her name is Merwin. If you must flee, go to her. Take the north path at the bend of the river and follow the crows, but go only if you have no choice." The idea of fleeing struck Ellen as impossible. The forest was vast, tangled, and full of tales told to frighten children. Wolves, they said, walked like men in the deeper glades. Spirits of those hanged unjustly whispered from hollow trees. And yet, the fear of staying grew heavier each day. That night, as the household prepared for another feast, Geetha pressed a small pouch into Ellen's hand. "Flour and soot," she said simply. "Throw it in his eyes if he corners you. Then run. Don't look back." Ellen nodded. Her fingers curled tightly around the pouch, her palms damp. The feast began with laughter and music, and Ellen moved through the revelry like a ghost. Her senses were sharp with dread. Sir Alaric was already deep in his cups, his smile growing wider as the hour grew later. Then came the moment she feared most. Ellen. Damisolda's voice rang out across the chamber. Sir Alaric requests your presence to help with his cloak. See to him. It was not a request. Ellen's feet moved before her heart caught up. She felt as though she were walking to her own burial. The hallway beyond the great chamber stretched endlessly, lit only by guttering torches. At the far end, the door to Sir Alaric's chamber stood open, the fire within flickering like a beast's breath. He was waiting, half reclined on the bench near the hearth. His tunic undone at the collar, his smile too relaxed. "Ah," he said, as though they were old friends. "You've come." Ellen stepped inside, heart pounding. She kept the pouch hidden in the folds of her apron, eyes low. "My lord," she said, her voice barely audible, "you wish for my help?" He rose, walking toward her. "So shy," he said, "so pure. You do not yet know what power you hold." She stepped back. "Please, my lord, I must return." He reached for her wrist. The pouch flew from her hand. Just a burst of white and black clouded the air as flour and soot struck his face. He roared in shock, stumbling back, clawing at his eyes. Ellen turned and ran, her feet pounding down the corridor. The halls twisted, the shadows leapt, but she did not stop. Down the servants' stair, through the cold pantry, and out into the night. The wind slapped her cheeks raw. She did not know where Geetha was, only that she had to flee before he called the steward, before the manor closed its jaws around her. She ran until the air cut her throat and her legs nearly failed. Past the river bend, into the northern path. The trees closed in, ancient and silent. Owls stirred. The crows watched. And still she ran. Hours passed in a haze. When the forest finally opened into a clearing, a dim light flickered from a crooked little hut. The scent of moss and smoke curled through the air. She collapsed at the threshold, gasping. The door creaked open. The Mirwin stood within, her eyes clouded with age, but piercing still. "You've come," the old woman said, as though she had known all along. And so the forest became her refuge. The manor behind her, its walls now filled with anger, with questions, with lies told by those who would rather silence a girl than a knight. But Ellen had fled, and for now, in the cradle of the woods, she was beyond their reach. Though peace would not come easy, nor safety without cost, she had chosen to run. To survive, the morning that followed Ellen's flight was wrapped in a heavy mist, the kind that blurred the edges of all things, branches, stones, and memories alike. Birds sang cautiously in the canopy above, their notes soft and broken, as if mourning something unseen. Ellen awoke on a pile of straw laid hastily near the hearth, wrapped in an old woolen cloak that smelled faintly of thyme and smoke. The cottage was unlike any place she had ever known. It leaned as though listening to the forest's secrets, its roof thick with moss, its shutters worn thin by time. Dried herbs hung from the beams in clusters, sage, yarrow, mugwort, and others she could not name. Shelves lined the walls, filled with jars of peculiar contents, feathers, roots, small bones, and stones marked with ancient runes. There was no cross above the hearth, only a bundle of rowan tied with red twine, like the charm Geetha had given her. Mirwin moved about with quiet certainty, her cane tapping gently against the packed earth floor. Her eyes, though veiled with the gray film of age, seemed to see beyond what light revealed. She did not ask Ellen for her tale. Perhaps she had no need. Or perhaps, like all wise women of the old ways, she knew that stories took root only when they were ready to bloom. "You'll rest here for now," she said, her voice creaking like an old door, but the forest is no place for idleness. There is always work, even in sanctuary. And so Ellen worked. She swept the floor and tended the fire, carried buckets from the stream, and gathered herbs under Mirwin's direction. They rarely spoke of the past, though silence between them did not feel heavy. It was the silence of trees and stones, a silence filled with watching, not judgment. Each day, Ellen learned, not from books, there were none, but from the rhythm of the land and the hands of the old woman. She learned the names of plants that healed and those that harmed. She learned to listen to the wind and to read the sky's mood by the shapes of clouds. Mirwin showed her how to mix tinctures, how to wrap a sprain with comfrey, how to ease fevers with elderflower. And she spoke, too, of the old gods, the mothers of stone and stream, whose names had been buried by the church, but whose whispers still danced through the leaves. "You must know the land to know yourself," Mirwin said once, while crushing bark into powder. They teach you obedience, but not understanding. Understanding is what keeps a woman alive. Ellen nodded, though part of her still carried fear. Fear of pursuit, of being found, of being dragged back to the manor like a stray lamb. But in time, the forest wrapped itself around her, and her fear softened into caution. She began to feel something she had not known since childhood: agency. Small, tentative, like the first bud of spring pushing through frost. One evening, as the moon rose fat and low behind the trees, Ellen sat on the stone step of the cottage, shelling beans by lamplight. Mirwin joined her, wrapped in a thick shawl, her cane resting beside her knee. "You are not the first," she said quietly. Ellen paused, her fingers still. "Not the first girl to run," Mirwin continued. "Not the first to be hunted with soft voices and sharp smiles. The world does not favor women who say no." "Did you run too?" Ellen asked, voice small. Mirwin did not answer at once. Her gaze lifted toward the trees, the moonlight casting a silver crown upon her brow. "I," she said at last. "I ran. I bled. I lost more than I ever found again. But I learned the names of all the things that tried to break me. And when you name a thing, you rob it of some of its power." Ellen looked down at her lap. The beans were half done. The fireflies had begun their dance. "I don't know what I am anymore," she whispered. "I was a daughter, a servant. I didn't want to be nothing, but now I'm not anything else either." Mirwin reached out, her hand gnarled and warm. "You are between stories, child. One ended when you fled. The next has yet to begin. But it will, and you shall write it with your own hands." That night, Ellen dreamed of water. She stood by the stream where she once fetched water for her mother's bread. But this time, she stepped into it. The current was strong, and it pulled away the things that clung to her: the touch of Alaric's hand, the sharpness of Dame Isolde's voice, the burning in her feet from the manor floors. When she awoke, her cheeks were wet with tears, but her breath was steady. The days grew shorter. Autumn crept through the trees with golden fingers. Ellen wore layers of linen and wool, her hair now woven into simple braids to keep it from the brambles. She walked with more surety, her eyes clear, her back straight. She was still young, but the forest had begun to shape her in quiet, invisible ways. Sometimes, villagers from far-off hamlets came to the hut, women mostly, with sick children or aching joints, sometimes with questions too shameful to ask the priest. Mirwin dealt with them all with the same gruff care, and Ellen watched, learning more with each visit. But not all eyes were kind. One late afternoon, as Ellen gathered mushrooms near the edge of the wood, she heard a voice behind her. A man's voice, sharp with surprise. "You, girl!" She turned slowly, heart thudding. A woodsman, no older than 20, stood before her, holding a sack of kindling. His eyes narrowed as he studied her face. "You were at the manor, weren't you? The one that vanished." Ellen froze. He stepped closer. "They're still looking. You know, the steward says you stole something. They say you were wicked." Ellen's lips parted, but no words came. He looked at her, truly looked, and then something shifted. He shook his head and backed away. "Ain't my business," he muttered. "Just be careful." Then he was gone, swallowed by the trees. Ellen stood alone, breath caught in her throat. The past was not done with her. Not yet. She walked back to the cottage with a new heaviness in her limbs. As she stepped inside, Mirwin looked up from her weaving and said without turning, "The wind shifts, girl. Storms don't always come with thunder." And so Ellen braced herself, for the forest was kind, but the world beyond its branches still hunted her name. The wind turned colder that week. Leaves that once clung tightly to their branches began to lose their grip, floating down in quiet spirals to blanket the earth. The forest, once thick with birdsong and buzzing life, grew stiller, as if holding its breath for what was to come. Even the brook near the cottage babbled less boldly, its voice hushed beneath a film of early frost. Ellen felt the change in her bones before she saw it in the trees. Her dreams had grown more vivid, half memories, half warnings. Faces blurred by time swam to the surface of her mind, her mother's hands kneading dough, Geetha's stern eyes, the gleam of silver on Sir Alaric's sword hilt. Each morning she awoke with her jaw clenched, her fists curled as though she had been fighting even in sleep. Mirwin noticed. "You are listening too hard to the past," she said one morning while grinding dried valerian root into powder. "It speaks loudly when you give it room. Better to let it echo than answer." Ellen nodded, but her thoughts remained tangled. They were preparing a poultice for a woman from Thornhill whose husband had returned from the fields fevered and coughing blood. Illness, like rumor, traveled on cold air. The villagers who came now were more desperate, more tight-lipped. Some glanced at Ellen as if trying to place her, but Merwin's presence acted as a shield. The old woman's reputation, part healer, part witch in the eyes of the fearful, kept most questions at bay. Still, the woods no longer felt entirely safe. Each snapping twig behind Ellen sent a chill through her spine. She began avoiding the northern paths and never ventured alone without a knife tucked into her bodice. Merwin, for her part, began teaching her new lessons, darker ones. How to mix herbs that induce sleep. How to make a paste that numbed pain. How to hide a trail. Survival, the old woman said grimly, is not always gentle. One evening, as dusk poured through the treetops like ink, a knock came to the cottage door. 3 short raps, then silence. Ellen froze, a pot of nettle stew still warm in her hands. Merwin nodded once, and Ellen stepped back as the old woman opened the door. A man stood there, tall, cloaked, his face shadowed beneath a hood. He removed it slowly, revealing sharp features weathered by travel. His hair was dark, streaked with gray, and his eyes, though tired, missed nothing. "Merwin," he said with the familiarity of someone who had come before. "Brother Atherick," she answered, not warmly, but with respect. "Come in." He stepped inside, the cold clinging to him like smoke. Ellen moved to the side, studying him with quiet caution. He wore the robes of a Benedictine, though they were patched and stained with mud. "You've taken in another," Atherick said, nodding toward Ellen. "I've taken in a girl," Merwin replied, "as I've done before." He glanced at Ellen again, and though his gaze was not unkind, it held a weight that pressed against her skin. "There are murmurs," he said, lowering his voice, "of a servant girl gone missing, of a nobleman humiliated. The lord of the manor is pressing the bishop for justice. Coins have exchanged hands." Merwin stirred the fire with a stick, her face unmoved. "And what do the coins buy this time?" "Searchers, letters to nearby parishes, quiet inquiries." Ellen felt her breath catch. The walls of the forest, once so wide and wild, suddenly felt closer, tighter. Atherick looked at her again. "If they come this far, they'll come with swords, not parchment." "I know," Merwin said, "and she knows too." Ellen nodded, her voice steady despite the fear clawing inside. "I won't go back." "No," the monk agreed. "You can't." They sat in silence for a while, the fire snapping softly between them. Outside, the first snowflakes drifted down, catching in the crevices of bark and stone. Before he left, Atherick handed Merwin a small cloth bundle. "For the girl," he said. "There are names in here. Women who can be trusted from Ely to Eberacum. If she must move, she'll need them." He did not say goodbye to Ellen, only nodded, and then he vanished into the dark, his footsteps quickly swallowed by the snow. That night, Ellen could not sleep. She sat by the hearth long after Merwin had retired, her eyes fixed on the flames. The bundle Atherick left sat in her lap unopened. She knew what it meant. A chain of safety, yes, but also a farewell. One day, perhaps soon, she would need to run again. She opened the bundle slowly. Inside were names written in a careful hand on thick parchment. Alongside them were pressed sprigs of dried lavender, each a marker, each a promise. Safety and scent, in solidarity. She traced the first name with her finger. Leora, Abbess of Lynmere. Then another, Edith, widow of a smith. Then another, Tanwyn, keeper of an herb garden near the marsh. Women, all women. Not warriors, not knights, but strong in their own hidden ways. A network of quiet power, passed not by sword, but by whisper. The thought comforted her more than she expected. She did not sleep until the fire died low and the forest grew still again. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the world in a hush as deep as time itself. And in the quiet, Ellen prepared, not to flee blindly, but to choose her path when the time came. She was no longer only the hunted. She was learning to be the storm. By morning, the snow lay thick upon the forest floor, blanketing the undergrowth in a soft, deceptive silence. Ellen stepped out of the cottage with a woven basket on her hip, her boots crunching gently over the crusted white. Her breath rose in pale curls before her, and though the cold bit at her cheeks, she welcomed its sting. It reminded her that she was still here, still breathing, still free. The trees groaned under the weight of the snow. Their limbs bowed like old men at prayer. Every sound was muffled. Even the crows, those black-hearted watchers of the woods, had fallen quiet. Mirwin had sent her to gather pine resin and dried nettle stalks, both useful in the making of poultices and fire starters. But Ellen knew, even without words, that the true purpose of the errand was to help her think, to walk, to breathe, to turn the recent days over in her hands like river stones. She followed the familiar trail past the fox den and the fallen ash tree, down toward the glade where the nettles grew wild in warmer seasons. The resin she could gather from the bark directly, chipping it carefully with her small knife. She worked slowly, watching her breath, listening to the woods. But her mind kept returning to the parchment bundle, those names written in monk's script, wrapped in dried lavender and hidden now beneath a loose stone in the cottage hearth. They were more than names to her. They were destinations, possibilities, every one of them a door waiting to be knocked upon, a fire waiting to be rekindled. Ellen's fingers were beginning to numb by the time she finished her gathering. She turned to head back, but stopped. There, pressed into the snow near the edge of the glade, were tracks. Not deer, not fox. Too wide, too deliberate, boot prints. Her heart jumped. She knelt, brushing away the snow more carefully. The edges were soft but recent, less than a day old, perhaps even hours. She glanced around the clearing. The tracks led eastward, deeper into the forest, away from the path, away from the cottage. For a long moment she did not move. Every lesson from Mirwin pressed into her memory like a bell tolling. Always notice. Always ask, who walked here before you and why? She quickened her pace back to the cottage, never breaking into a run, lest her panic betray her. When she arrived, the door creaked open before she could lift the latch. Mirwin stood within, her eyes dark with knowing. "You saw them," she said. Ellen nodded. "Not many. 2 sets, maybe 3. "More than enough," Mirwin murmured. They spoke little as they prepared. Mirwin gathered herbs into pouches, wrapped dried meat in cloth, and carefully tucked a flint and steel into a small leather bag. Ellen fetched the names from beneath the hearthstone, then packed her own satchel. Small, light, essential. "I will not go with you," Mirwin said, not unkindly, but with a finality that rooted Ellen to the floor. "I am too old and I am known. They may find me and call me witch, and perhaps they will be right. But you must go." Ellen opened her mouth to protest, but Mirwin held up a hand. "You were not meant to stay forever. Sanctuary is not a lifetime, child. It is a pause, a breath before the next climb." She handed Ellen a wooden pendant, carved with the shape of a hare, swift-footed, wild, and free. "Show this to Leora, the abbess. She'll know you came from me." Ellen tucked the charm into her pouch, her hands trembling. "Do not take the road," Mirwin added. "Cut through the alder copse to the west. Follow the stream until you find the stone bridge with the ivy. Cross it, then head north. Keep the sun on your left at morning. If you meet anyone, speak little and smile less." Then, for the first time in all their days together, Mirwin embraced her. It was not a gentle hug, but a firm, anchoring one, like being held by the earth itself. "Go," the old woman whispered, "before the snow tells them where to find you." And so, before midday, Ellen vanished into the forest once more, this time not as a hunted thing, but as one with a path. The stream murmured beside her, half frozen but faithful, and she walked with purpose, cloak drawn tight, every sound now a sign, every tree a sentinel. She did not look back. Behind her, the world she had known was already folding into shadow. Ahead, the road was uncertain. The names in her pouch glowed like lanterns in her mind. Leora, Edie, Tanwin. She whispered them under her breath like a prayer, like a promise. The hair charm beat gently against her side with each step. She would not be caught again. She would not be silent. And in her silence, she would carry the voices of every girl who had ever run, every woman who had ever stood at the edge of a forest and wondered if freedom lay beyond the trees. The forest in winter was a cathedral of hush. As Ellen moved westward, deeper into the alder copse, the trees leaned in with silent grace, their limbs bare and silvered by frost. The stream guided her, a thin thread of dark water winding through the white, murmuring secrets in a voice only the woods understood. She kept her pace steady, stopping only to drink or adjust her bundle. Though the cold gnawed at her fingertips, it also cloaked her from pursuit. Snow erased footprints as swiftly as they were made. Time became strange beneath the canopy. Daylight filtered weakly through the branches. casting a grayish pall that made it difficult to judge the hour. Ellen relied instead on the sun's pale position and the flow of the stream. She walked until her legs ached and her breath came in clouds too thick to see through. When evening approached, she found shelter beneath a fallen tree whose roots had upturned, creating a hollow in the earth. She gathered dry twigs and leaves, struck flint, and coaxed a fire into life. That first night alone in the wild was hard. The darkness felt alive, pressing in from all sides. Every crack of a branch or flutter of wings startled her. She kept her knife close and her back to the hollow, the fire between her and whatever might come. Sleep was shallow, broken by dreams of torchlight and pounding boots, of men's laughter twisted into jeers. But each time she woke, the hair pendant at her neck reminded her she was not prey. The next morning, a red sun broke through the mist, casting the snow in soft rose tones. Ellen rose stiff and sore, but undeterred. She resumed her journey, chewing on dried meat and elderberry cakes Mirwin had prepared. The forest grew denser, the trees packed close as if whispering behind their bark. Ivy crept over fallen stones, and birds called with hoarse winter voices. By midday, she reached the stone bridge. It arched low over the stream, half covered in moss and draped in ivy like an old altar. The stones were slick with ice, and she crossed carefully, one foot after another, hand trailing the cold, ancient wall for balance. On the far side, the forest began to change, less wild, more tended. She saw the faint signs of paths, of snared brush cleared for walking. Someone had passed here not long ago. Caution returned like a second skin. Ellen stayed off the main trail, skirting along deer paths and through groves of holly. Her goal was Lindmere, where the abbess Leora kept a convent hidden from the eyes of noblemen and bishops alike. Mirwin had spoken of it once, in a voice touched by reverence. A place where women lived not as servants or chattel, but as minds, as hearts. A sanctuary not just of stone, but of spirit. By the third night, her strength was waning. Her boots were soaked through from crossing a half-frozen stream, and the chill had settled deep in her bones. She huddled beneath a pine, wrapped in her cloak, praying silently. Not to saints, but to the forest itself, to the mothers of the earth, as Mirwin had taught her, to the ghosts of those who had fled before her. When morning came, she woke to the sound of bells, faint, distant, but real, not the tolling of a great cathedral, but the soft peal of handbells carried on the wind. Ellen rose, heart leaping. She climbed a small ridge and gasped. Below, nestled between folds of hills and half shielded by trees, was Lindmere. It was not grand, no towering spires or golden roofs. The convent was built of gray stone and thatch, its walls modest, its chapel small, but it stood, whole and steady against the winter, smoke curling from its chimneys, and in that moment, it was the most beautiful place Ellen had ever seen. She approached slowly, her movements cautious. As she reached the outer wall, a figure stepped into view, an older woman in a pale woolen habit, carrying a basket of firewood. She turned, saw Ellen, and paused. Ellen reached into her pouch, her fingers trembling, and drew forth the hair pendant. She held it up without speaking. The woman's eyes widened slightly. She nodded once and gestured for Ellen to follow. Inside the walls, the air was still and warm. The convent buzzed with quiet activity, nuns tending goats, spinning flax, and preparing root vegetables for stew. No one looked at Ellen with suspicion. No one asked questions. She was led through a stone corridor into a small chamber lit by candlelight, where another woman sat by a writing desk, her fingers ink-stained, her eyes keen beneath a linen veil. "I am Abbess Leora," she said, "and you are a guest of Merwin." Ellen nodded, her throat tight. "You are safe here?" Leora continued gently, "For as long as you choose to stay." Those words, simple, soft, unlocked something in Ellen. She sank to her knees, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. She did not sob. The soundless grief of all she had carried simply spilled out, melted like ice before the fire. Leora did not rush her. When Ellen finally lifted her head, the abbess offered her a cup of warm cider, thick with honey and clove. "Rest first," she said. "The world will still be here when you wake." And so Ellen rested. Not the shallow, hunted sleep of the wild, but true rest, body, heart, and soul. She lay on a straw-stuffed mattress beneath woolen blankets, the scent of beeswax and lavender surrounding her, and for the first time since the manor, she slept without fear. Outside, snow continued to fall, but within Lindmere's walls, the storm had paused. Ellen had arrived at a place that did not demand her silence, only her truth. The days at Lindmere passed like ripples across a still pond, quiet, unhurried, each one softening the sharp edges of Ellen's spirit. She woke each morning to the toll of a small bell rung by Sister Katrin, a pale and gentle nun who smiled often but spoke seldom. Together, the women of the convent moved in quiet harmony, milking goats, tending gardens even in winter's grip, preparing simple meals of broth and oatcakes, and copying texts by candlelight. Their world was one of rhythm and reverence, not for gold or glory, but for work done with care, for lives lived without fear. Ellen found herself slowly folding into this rhythm. At first, she watched more than she acted. She learned how to card wool and mend worn habits, how to prepare poultices from dried herbs stored in linen-wrapped bundles, and how to knead dough in the cold mornings before dawn. Her hands, once blistered and raw from the manor's harsh stones, grew skilled in gentler labors. The sisters did not ask of her past, nor did they measure her by what she could offer. They accepted her presence as one accepts the coming of spring, as something natural and necessary. Abbess Leora, wise and patient, became a kind of anchor. In the evenings, she would call Ellen to the scriptorium, where the abbess copied sermons and letters in fine, deliberate strokes. There, by the golden glow of beeswax candles, they spoke in murmurs. "You carry much," Leora said one night, her eyes not leaving the parchment. "You wear it in your shoulders, like armor." Ellen hesitated. Then, slowly, she replied, "If I set it down, I don't know what's left." Leora looked up. "Then set it down gently, piece by piece. You may find the burden lighter when shared." It was not an order, nor even advice. It was an invitation. And so, in time, Ellen told her story. Not all at once, but in fragments, like scattered beads strung slowly together. She spoke of her village and her mother, of the manor's cold walls and the danger wrapped in honeyed words, of Gita's wisdom, Merwin's strength, and the night she fled beneath the watching stars. Leora listened without interruption, her expression still and solemn. "You are not the first," she said when Ellen finished, "nor will you be the last. The world does not yet know how to love its daughters." Those words lodged deep in Ellen's heart. At Lindmere, she began to unlearn fear. The sisters taught her not only skills of survival, but knowledge rarely given to women outside cloistered walls. She read from the Psalms in Latin, recited poetry written by long-dead noblewomen, and learned to count and record the moon's phases. Each lesson was a gift, not only of the mind, but of the self. For the first time, Ellen felt the slow blooming of something unfamiliar. Worthiness. Yet not all moments at Lindmere were free of shadows. News came, now and then, in the form of traders who brought cloth and honey in exchange for herbs and candles. Whispers passed between lips like wind through reeds, of soldiers on the move, of rumors from the bishop's court, of a girl once belonging to a manor lord who had vanished without trace. Her name was not spoken aloud, but Ellen knew the story was hers. It wandered still, reshaped by retellings, but carried danger all the same. One afternoon, as snow turned to sleet and the sky darkened prematurely, Ellen found herself in the chapel alone. The stained glass window above the altar cast soft colors across the stone floor, painting her cloak in hues of blue and gold. She knelt, not in prayer, but in reflection. She no longer felt hunted, but neither did she feel entirely safe. She had heard of Edith, the widow on Leora's list, a woman who lived in a smithy's cottage near the coast, where the waves roared louder than men's voices. Some said she harbored runaways and healed those bruised by more than just the hand. And then there was Tanwin, the herb woman who lived beyond the marshlands, whose garden bloomed with rare roots and whose past was known to no one. These were not just names. They were paths, choices. The abbess had never urged her to stay or to leave. Lindmere was sanctuary, not a snare. It would not hold her if her heart moved elsewhere. That night, Ellen sat in the cloister garden beside Sister Katrin, who was spinning thread beneath a canopy of withering ivy. "Did you choose to stay?" Ellen asked her quietly. Katrin's hands never paused. "I chose to stop running." "Were you running from something?" "No," Katrin said, threading wool through her spindle with practiced ease. "I was running toward something. Peace. A place where I could breathe." Ellen nodded slowly. The words rested in her chest like warm coals. She did not yet know if Lindmere was her final destination or merely a chapter in her journey. But she knew now that she had choices, that her life was not simply a thread to be woven by others, but something she could stitch with her own hands. And so she continued to learn, to heal, to mend. Winter deepened outside the walls, but within, candles were lit and bread was broken. The sound of laughter echoed faintly down the halls, mingled with the scrape of wool on stone and the quiet joy of women who had carved their own peace from a world that had denied it to them. Ellen, once only a servant, once only a girl, now began to shape herself into something else entirely. Not prey, not property, but a woman with roots growing deeper by the day and eyes turned always toward the light. The weeks slipped past like threads drawn from a spindle, slow and smooth, and winter's grip deepened around Lindmere. Frost adorned the windows each morning, lacing the panes with delicate filigree, while the breath of the sisters rose like incense during the early prayers. In the stillness of that cloistered world, Ellen found an unexpected rhythm, gentler than any she had known before, but never idle. She had come to know each of the sisters by the little sounds they made. Sister Mably, who hummed tunelessly when baking bread. Sister Katrin, who sighed before speaking, as if each word required careful choosing. Sister Roswin, whose laughter was rare but always startlingly loud, like thunder on a summer day. Each woman carried her own story, and though they seldom spoke of the lives they had left behind, Ellen could read them in glances, in silences, in the careful way they touched one another's shoulders in passing. She had begun copying texts under Abbess Leora's guidance. Simple things at first, psalms and prayers, but soon more complex works, herbal treatises, letters to distant abbeys, records of births and deaths in nearby hamlets. Her hand grew steady, and her Latin, once foreign and stilted, began to flow more easily. But it was in the infirmary that she found her truest comfort. There, among jars of dried flowers and linen bandages, Ellen's hands moved with purpose. She had learned from Merwin the names of roots and leaves, but from Leora she now learned how to treat more than fevers and wounds, how to tend to grief, to weariness, to the quiet despair that sometimes crept in through cracks in even the strongest of hearts. One day in early Lent, a young woman was brought to the convent. Her name was Britha, and she had walked 3 days through snow and sleet from a village near the coast. Her lips were blue, her eyes vacant, her hands raw from cold. She said little, only that her uncle had promised her to a man she would not name, and she had fled on the night of the betrothal. She is bone-tired, Leora said, brushing Britha's hair gently from her face. She needs warmth and quiet and time. Ellen was assigned to tend her. She bathed the girl's feet in warm water, steeped with mint and lavender, wrapped her in woolen blankets, and fed her broth spoon by spoon. Days passed before Britha spoke again. "I thought I would die," she whispered one night, her voice barely audible above the wind outside. "But then I saw the light in the chapel window. I thought, perhaps God had not forgotten me after all." Ellen clasped her hand and for the first time realized she had become something more than a guest at Lindmere. She was now its steward too, a bearer of the same light that had once saved her. Yet even in the peace of the convent, Ellen could feel change stirring. Leora began sending her further afield, to nearby villages, to deliver tinctures or assist with childbirths when no midwife could be found. These journeys, though brief, stirred memories in Ellen. Of the path through the forest, the sound of hounds in the distance, the echo of boots on stone. She carried her name carefully, offering only Ellen of Lindmere when asked, and trusted that the abbess's reputation would shield her. But one morning, while returning from a cottage in the hills, she stopped at a small market near the village of Penrith. She kept her hood low, exchanged root powders for beeswax candles, and turned to leave, only to find herself face to face with a merchant's boy, no older than 16, staring at her with wide eyes. You're the girl from Alderwick," he said, voice hushed with awe and uncertainty. "The one who ran." Ellen's breath caught. "I don't mean harm," he added quickly. They said you'd been taken by bandits or drowned in the mire, but here you are." She didn't speak. Her fingers tightened around her basket. "They're still looking," he said. "The steward swore vengeance on his honor, said you stole from the manor, ruined a nobleman's name. There's talk of coin for your return." A silence fell between them. "I won't tell," the boy said after a moment. "You look better, Happier, maybe. Ellen's voice returned like a trickle of water after a drought. Thank you. She left quickly, her steps brisk, her heart pounding. Back at Lindmere, she went straight to the abbess's chambers. Lyora listened quietly as Ellen recounted the encounter, her expression unchanged. Truth will always seek the light, she said gently. But so does danger. You must decide, child. Will you let them define your name, or will you shape it for yourself? That night, Ellen could not sleep. She sat alone in the chapel, watching the flicker of candles against the stained glass. She thought of Britha, of Mirwin, of the names in her satchel, Edith, Tanwin, others who had carved space for themselves beyond the reach of men who claimed dominion over their lives. She knew now that Lindmere, as precious as it had become, might not always remain untouched. Sooner or later, the world would find its way here. But she was not the same girl who had run barefoot through snow and shadow. She was not only a survivor, she was becoming a protector, a voice, a fire. And soon she would need to carry that light beyond the safety of these walls. The morning after her restless vigil in the chapel, Ellen rose before the first bell and stepped outside into the brittle air of late winter. The sky above Lindmere was veiled in a soft, colorless gray, and frost clung to the flagstones like breath frozen in mid-sigh. All around her, the convent slept beneath its quilt of silence and snow, unaware that within her chest something had shifted. She walked toward the garden, where bare branches stood like sentinels above the sleeping herbs. The sage and rosemary lay curled beneath straw, their spirits waiting for spring's warmth. Ellen crouched beside them, running her fingers gently over the straw as if to reassure the roots hidden below. Everything in its time, she reminded herself, even courage. Later that morning, she joined Abbess Leora in the scriptorium. The older woman was binding a small book of homilies, her fingers stained with glue and ink. Without looking up, she said softly, "You've decided." Ellen nodded. "I need to go. Not forever, but outward. There are others." Leora paused, pressing the spine of the book with care. "You are not bound to this place, Ellen. We gave you shelter, not chains. I want to help women like Britha, girls like me." Her voice wavered only slightly. "I want to find Edith and Tanwin and learn from them. Carry what I've learned here further." Leora smiled faintly, her eyes still focused on the parchment. "Then you must go with my blessing. But go prepared. The world beyond these walls has not grown kinder in your absence." Ellen spent the next week readying herself. The sisters helped without question. Katrin stitched a woolen cloak, dyed dark green to blend with trees and shadow. Mabley filled a pouch with healing herbs, each one labeled in Latin and vernacular. Roswin fashioned a belt of braided hemp, strong enough to carry tools, a knife, and the little hair pendant that had hung by her heart since Merwin placed it in her hand. When the day of departure came, the air was cold but clear, and the snow had melted just enough to reveal the beginnings of crocus and coltsfoot in the convent garden, a sign of renewal, of return. Ellen stood at the gate, her satchel slung across her back, and looked once more at the chapel, the cloisters, the women whose quiet strength had mended her. Leora approached last, placing a small parchment scroll into Ellen's hand. "A letter for Edith," the abbess said. "It will vouch for you. And should you ever need sanctuary again, this place remains your hearth." Ellen embraced her, the scent of beeswax and parchment lingering on the abbess's robes. "Thank you," she whispered. With that, she turned and passed through the wooden gate, the world opening before her like a book turned to a new page. The road to Edith's village wound northward along a low, craggy coast where gulls wheeled over foaming waters. Ellen traveled on foot, alone but no longer afraid. She stayed in barns and roadside chapels, bartering herbs and mending in exchange for shelter. Her hands grew calloused again, but they remained steady, full of purpose. When she reached the village of Grenwood, the sun was dipping low behind slate-colored hills, and a salty wind pressed against her face. The smithy stood at the edge of the town, broad-shouldered and blackened by years of fire. A woman stood beside the forge, striking iron on an anvil, sparks leaping like fireflies around her. Edith. She was not what Ellen had imagined, not frail or quiet, but tall and strong, with arms like seasoned oak and eyes as sharp as whetted steel. She wore no veil, no ring, no emblem of husband or house. She worked as though the world had never tried to break her. Ellen approached and held out Leora's letter. Edith took it, wiped her hands on her apron, and read. After a moment, she looked up, her eyes meeting Ellen's without judgment. "So you're the one Merwin warned would come." Her voice was low, steady. "You're not late, but you've walked a long road." "I have," Ellen replied. Edith nodded. "Then you'll eat first, talk after." Inside her cottage, the walls were hung with tools and herbs, and a fire crackled in a hearth that smelled of iron and rosemary. Ellen sat at the table, watching as Edith ladled stew into 2 bowls. "You're not the first girl I've sheltered," Edith said as they ate. "Won't be the last. The world has a habit of grinding down women until all that's left is silence. But silence doesn't mean peace." "I don't want to be silent," Ellen said. "Then don't." They spoke deep into the night. Of Merwin, of Lindmere, of what it meant to survive and to teach others how. Edith told her stories of women who came with bruises hidden beneath woolen sleeves, of girls who arrived with no name left, only fear. She taught Ellen to temper steel, to strike with purpose, to shape not just iron, but herself. In the weeks that followed, Ellen became both apprentice and sister. She learned how to mend not only wounds, but weapons. How to listen, truly listen, when a girl arrived at the edge of the forge with eyes full of fire and shame. And though the wind outside howled and the road ahead was uncertain, Ellen had found another hearth, another teacher. She was building herself anew, not from the pieces others had left behind, but from the will to rise, again and again, with hands unbound and heart unafraid. Spring came slowly to Grenwood, drawn out by cold rains and wind from the sea. The trees along the northern cliffs awakened in reluctant stages, buds swelling and pausing before finally bursting into fragile leaf. In the forge behind Edith's cottage, however, life surged forward with relentless heat. Each morning the fire was kindled anew, and the anvil rang like a chapel bell, clear, sure, and unwavering. Ellen worked beside Edith with sleeves rolled and hair bound, soot clinging to her skin and sweat beading at her brow. The strength of the forge was unlike anything she had known. Here, fire and force shaped not only metal, but resolve. She learned how to temper blades and rivet hinges, how to bellows the coals until they sang red, and how to judge the moment a piece of iron became malleable, ready for change. "Like people," Edith had said one day, "they crack if you press them cold, but if you wait and you listen and you heat them right, they'll bend. They'll become something new." But it wasn't only smithing that Edith taught. Each week, 1 or 2 women came to the forge under the guise of collecting tools or nails. Some bore the bruises of their stories on their faces or arms. Others wore invisible wounds in their silence, in the way they flinched at loud sounds or avoided the hearth's flame. Edith would take them into the back room, offer tea steeped with valerian and chamomile, and listen. And when they left, they carried more than iron. Sometimes they carried hope. Ellen became part of this quiet rhythm of refuge. She learned when to speak and when to let silence do the work. She mixed poultices for burns and cuts, sat beside trembling hands, and shared her own story, not as a confession, but as a light, dim at first, then steady. One girl, Willa, came at dusk, eyes ringed with sleeplessness. She said her husband had taken to the drink and to fists, and that she could no longer bear the waiting. Waiting to be struck, waiting to vanish into a grave no one would dig. Ellen took her hands and said gently, "You've waited long enough." Willa stayed in the spare room for 3 nights. Then she left, walking east with a satchel of bread and a blade Edith had fashioned. A small, beautiful knife with a carved hilt, meant not for vengeance, but for strength. "That's what we give them," Edith said afterward. "A blade they choose to carry, not one turned against them." As spring deepened, Ellen felt the forest within her growing again. Roots that Merwin had planted, nurtured by Laura and now tempered by Edith, took hold. She was no longer simply healing, she was forging. One evening, after the forge had cooled and the wind outside smelled of blooming heather, Edith poured 2 mugs of warm ale and joined Ellen beneath the low-beamed eaves. The sun was sliding toward the sea, its last rays touching the iron tools hung on the wall with a soft, golden kiss. "You've been with me 3 moons now," Edith said, sipping her ale. "Do you feel ready for what comes next?" Ellen didn't answer immediately. She looked out toward the darkening path, the one that led beyond Grenwood, beyond the comfort of Edith's forge, into the broader world where other women still walked in silence and fear. "I do," she said quietly, But I also feel I'll never truly be ready. Not completely, Edith nodded. That's how you know you are. That night, Ellen returned to her small room at the back of the cottage and took out the bundle from Lindmere, the list of names given by Athelric, still crisp despite her travels. Some had already faded from reach, but one name now called to her, Tanwyn, the herb woman of the marsh. She had heard whispers of her from the women who came through. A healer, yes, but something more, a weaver of secrets. A woman who had refused a bishop's summons and lived still. Her garden was said to bloom in defiance of season or soil, her house raised from stone and root, hidden deep beyond the reed-choked lands where few dared go. Ellen packed slowly. Her satchel now held more than it had before, not just tools and herbs, but stories, names, and knowledge etched into her heart. The little hair pendant remained at her neck. It felt heavier now, not with fear, but with memory. She left at dawn. Edith stood at the threshold, arms crossed, gaze steady. Tanwyn's not like the others, she warned. She'll test you. Not with words, but with silence. And she won't come to meet you. You'll have to prove you're worth her time. I will, Ellen said, embracing her one last time. As she walked away, the sea breeze tugging at her cloak, the forge behind her already lit again, Ellen did not feel lost. She felt shaped. And as she turned her face toward the marshlands and the next piece of her journey, she carried with her the fire of all those who had helped her rise, warmed, not burned, by their belief. And she walked, not as one fleeing the past, but as one striding toward the future. Of course. Here is part 12 of the story. The days passed in a quiet ripple across the frost-veiled hills of Elmwick, and though the hours of light were few, each moment clung to the hearts of the villagers with a tender ache, like the hush that falls before a storm. Winter, with its silvery hush and brittle stillness, had settled thick upon the land. The women of Elmwick, as ever, bore the burden of the cold season with bent backs and pale, chapped hands. For Isolde, now nearing her 30th winter, the rhythm of life had become a long chant of habit and hushed endurance. Her body, weathered by childbirth and years of toil, still moved with graceful precision, churning butter, spinning wool, mending tunics by the hearthlight. Yet her eyes, once gleaming with the stubborn light of youth, carried the weary softness of one who had seen many go and few return. It was in these slow, dark days that stories from neighboring villages began to reach Elmwick, a trail of quiet words traded over bread and broth, murmured in the lulls between chores. There were whispers of a woman in Dunmere, a healer named Adelind, who had been tried for her craft. Not for poisoning or heresy, they said, but for knowledge itself. She had treated the ailments of women, childbirth fevers, swelling limbs, blood that came too early or too late, and in doing so, she had drawn suspicion. To be a woman who knew herbs was to walk a dangerous line. For Isolde, who remembered her mother's secret pouch of dried rue and mugwort, it was a tale that made her chest tighten. The church frowned upon such knowledge when wielded outside its own halls, and a woman's wisdom, however kindly given, could be twisted into witchcraft by fearful men. Isolde's own daughter, Leonie, now approaching the bloom of her 15th year, had taken to asking questions. Not just about herbs or childbirth, but about the world, why she must bow to Father Alric's sermons, why she could not run with the boys who trained with wooden swords, why she must learn to sew while her heart longed for the woods. It was a quiet rebellion, and Isolde watched it with both pride and fear. She remembered her own curiosity once, long ago, and how quickly it had been silenced. One evening, as wind howled through the timbered walls of their cottage, Isolde took out her mother's satchel, hidden beneath floorboards thick with dust. Inside lay a small bundle wrapped in linen, sprigs of dried yarrow, a mortar and pestle carved of soapstone, and a worn book bound in cracked leather. Its pages smelled of earth and candle wax, inscribed with careful, spidery Latin and margin notes in her mother's hand. She had not looked at it in years. By the firelight, she traced the script with calloused fingers, Leonie at her side, silent and wide-eyed. "What is it?" her daughter whispered. "It is knowledge," Isolde replied softly. "The kind women carry in their bones but are told to forget." Outside, the wind rattled the shutters. Over the following weeks, mother and daughter would steal moments between chores, hidden hours in the loft beneath the dim light of a single beeswax candle. Leonie listened with rapt attention as her mother spoke of the ways women in centuries past had passed down wisdom, whispered over cradles, stitched into tapestries, scratched into the margins of psalters. It was not rebellion for rebellion's sake, it was a way to remember and to survive. And yet, danger lurked like ice beneath the snow. A woman too clever, too curious, was rarely celebrated in any village. Word traveled fast, and envy traveled faster. One morning, as the first thawing rains began to soften the edges of winter's hold, a rider arrived in Elmwick. Clad in the sigil of the Lord Bishop of Whitevale, he bore a message for Father Ulrich, sealed in crimson wax and marked with a signet of the cross. Rumors began to stir. A search for heretics, it was said. A purge of those who trafficked in unsanctioned knowledge. They spoke not of flames, not yet, but of penitence and exile. Isolde's heart beat like a drum. She had not practiced healing openly. She had spoken only to Leonie. But suspicion needed no evidence, only the breath of one wrong word. And in a village as small as Elmwick, even breath could become a gale. She considered burying the book again, deeper this time, perhaps in the woods beyond the brook. But another part of her, older, wiser, wearier, knew the truth. The knowledge had already taken root in Leonie's heart. To bury it would not undo the truth of it. So instead, she taught her daughter caution, how to listen more than she spoke, how to mark a man's eyes before trusting his smile, how to speak in riddles and to cloak truth in the language of old prayers and proverbs. They rehearsed it by candlelight, like actors in a play whose stakes were far too real. And in those hours, Isolde felt her mother's spirit close by, guiding her hand, steadying her voice. But fear lingered, always, in the corners of the room, in the glances of neighbors who paused too long, in the silence of Father Ulrich's greetings. One dusk, as the mist curled low over the fields, Leonie asked a question that struck deep. "Will they burn us, Mother?" Isolde did not answer at first. She looked to the fire, to the flicker of orange across the wooden walls, and thought of Adelind of Dunmere, and all the women before her whose names had been lost to ashen memory. "They might," she said at last, her voice a thread of air. "But we carry more than fear. We carry all who came before us." Leonie nodded, not as a child, but as one who understood. Outside, spring was beginning to stir beneath the frost, a quiet awakening, slow and sure. And within the cottage, 2 generations of women sat by the fire, wrapped in the knowledge that though life was cruel and the world unkind, the ember of their truth would not be easily extinguished. Spring bloomed in slow reluctance, as if the earth itself still bore the weight of winter's hand. Buds unfurled with cautious grace, sheep birthed their lambs in the dew-drenched meadows, and the distant tolling of bells marked not only the rhythm of the seasons, but the return of travelers from market towns. Yet amid the gentle rebirth of the world, tension threaded through the village of Elmwick like a taut bowstring. Isolde walked the narrow paths with her head bowed, not in submission, but in quiet vigilance. She noticed everything now, the way old Marta's son avoided her gaze, how the baker's wife whispered with tightened lips behind her veil, how Father Ulrich's sermons had grown more fervent, more insistent on obedience and purity. The arrival of the bishop's rider had stirred something in the air, something watchful and brittle. One afternoon, as the sun broke weakly through low clouds, Leonie returned from the woods with her apron filled with nettles and wild garlic. Her cheeks were flushed with exertion, and her eyes shone with that strange mix of joy and worry that had become her mother's daily inheritance. They brewed a thin stew, and as the herbs mingled in the pot, their scent mingled too with memories of summers past, of Isolde's mother humming low tunes, of laughter shared before silence became the price of survival. The book, now kept beneath a loose board beneath the hearth, was read only by night. Its pages had grown more familiar to Leonie than her catechism, and she copied passages onto scraps of linen that she folded into her bodice like charms. Isolde often caught her whispering the words under her breath, not like spells, but like prayers. Then came the summons. It arrived not with ceremony, but with mud-caked boots on the doorstep. A reeve from a neighboring village stood before their cottage at dusk, accompanied by 2 men-at-arms whose cloaks bore the crest of the bishopric, a golden key upon a black field. His voice was measured, almost courteous, but the message it carried held no kindness. Isolde was to present herself for questioning at the chapel, a matter of routine, the Reeve said, a mere formality. Still, he watched her as one watches a fox too near the henhouse. After he departed, Leonie gripped her mother's hand with trembling fingers. Don't go, she pleaded. They mean to trap you. But Isolde only stroked her daughter's hair and said, we cannot hide from what they already believe. That night, she dressed simply. No talismans, no signs of defiance. She kissed Leonie's brow and left her in the care of their neighbor Anwin, whose own sister had once faced the church's scrutiny and never returned. The chapel, lit by flickering tallow candles, smelled of incense and damp stone. Father Ulrich waited beside the bishop's steward, a narrow-faced man whose eyes held neither pity nor anger, only the dull patience of bureaucracy. They asked questions softly, as if the weight of their words were not barbed. Had she treated anyone with illness? Had she dispensed herbs not sanctioned by the clergy? Had she spoken against the teachings of the church? To each, Isolde answered with careful truth. She had boiled nettle for coughs. She had offered willow bark for pain. She had taught her daughter not rebellion, but reverence for the quiet wisdom of the earth. Her voice remained even, her posture humble, but they listened not to her words, but to the spaces between them. In the end, they released her, but not before warning her that her practices must cease, that the church would be watching, that further inquiries would follow should more whispers arise. She walked home through the mist, her shoes soaked and her breath short. The wind whispered through the hedgerows like old voices. At the door, Leonie waited, her face pale and drawn. Are we safe? She asked. No, Isolde whispered, but we are not broken. In the days that followed, Isolde made no further mention of the book, nor the bishop's men. She resumed her duties as if the interrogation had never happened, yet something in her had changed, a stillness, a silence that had grown more resolute. She began to teach Leonie in other ways. How to read a man's fear before he acted on it. How to blend in when eyes turned too sharply. How to pass knowledge as a grandmother's tale or a children's rhyme. And Leonie, her spirit both frightened and fierce, took in every lesson with a solemnity far beyond her years. It was in these quiet acts that their defiance took root. For while the world might demand submission, and while women might be questioned, punished, or erased, the thread of their wisdom, subtle, enduring, unbroken, wove on. And though Elmwick slept each night beneath a shroud of fear, within one small cottage, the embers of knowing still glowed. Not with fire, but with the gentle heat of memory and the promise that not all knowledge could be extinguished. In this, there was strength. In this, there was hope. The summer came upon Elmwick not with grandeur, but with the gentle insistence of the sun rising earlier each morning, and the warmth that soaked into the bones of the weary. With it came color, the golden blaze of wheat swaying in the fields, the purple bloom of heather by the roadside, the riot of green where once snow had curled its white fingers. Yet beneath the abundance of the season, a quiet apprehension lingered, like the faint scent of smoke carried on the wind long after the fire has burned out. Isolde worked as she always had, with diligence and silence. Her hands stitched linens, her voice soothed the anxious cries of young mothers, and her presence was steady, predictable, reassuring. She smiled more, spoke less, and tread carefully. But within her, a slow ember smoldered. Not of rebellion, but of quiet refusal. For she understood now that to exist as a woman with knowledge was to stand on a precipice, every step measured between survival and suspicion. Leonie had grown more cautious, too. Gone were her open questions and breathless wonderings. Now she spoke with care, often with the cadence of parables and old tales. She listened more than she spoke, and her eyes held a deeper knowing. She was becoming what her mother and grandmother had been before her, a bearer of silent truths, a keeper of the flame that no one could see, yet many feared. But not all feared. Among the village's youth was a boy named Elias, a blacksmith's apprentice with soot-streaked skin and hands made of callus and flame. He had been Leonie's childhood companion, climbing trees, chasing geese, stealing apples from Father Ulrich's orchard, but those were days of innocence, tucked away in the folds of memory. Now he looked at her differently, not with possession, but with awe, as though he saw the wildness in her, the quiet strength, and wished only to understand it. He brought her little offerings when he could, smooth river stones, feathers of magpies, coins scorched black from the forge, and she, uncertain but curious, accepted them with a hesitant grace. Isolde watched this blooming affection with a cautious heart. She remembered her own first love, long lost to the years. The way dreams are easily born in youth and just as easily crushed by the iron of custom and law. Yet she said nothing. For Leonie would need to learn for herself what softness could survive in a world that so often demanded hardness from its women. One morning, Elias came to their cottage, bearing a question heavier than any token. "Would you walk with me to the old well?" he asked Leonie. Isolde overheard, and though her chest clenched with unease, she nodded. "The morning is bright. You'll be safe in the sun." The old well sat on the edge of the woods, half choked with moss and rimmed in ivy. It was a place of forgotten stories, where children dared each other to speak the names of ghosts, and old wives muttered charms when passing by. Here, Elias took Leonie's hand, rough and warm in hers. "I know what they whisper," he said softly. "About your mother, about you." She stiffened, but he did not let go. "They fear what they do not understand," he continued. "But I do not fear you." Leonie, overwhelmed by the purity of the moment, said nothing. Her eyes brimmed with questions she could not ask, emotions she had no name for. The breeze stirred the leaves above them, and the forest seemed to hold its breath. "They'll come again," Elias said after a pause. "From the bishopric. There are men in the next village, searching, asking." "Then you must not be seen with me," she whispered. "I won't leave you." His defiance stirred something deep in her, but she knew better than to feed it with promises. The world was not kind to those who stood with women like her. It swallowed them in silence or flame. Still, she let him kiss her hand before they parted, a kiss not of passion, but of recognition, of shared fate. That evening, Isolde spoke with her daughter as the stars shimmered above the thatched roof. "You care for him," she said. "I do," Leonie whispered. "But I don't know if that will save him, or doom us both." Isolde nodded, her heart aching with the burden of truths she could never fully pass down. "Love is a wild herb," she murmured. "It grows where it should not. It is trampled often, and yet it returns." In the days that followed, the presence of the bishop's men grew less distant. Riders passed through Elmwick more frequently, asking questions cloaked in civility. They spoke to the reeve. They spoke to Father Ulrich. They even visited the home of the village midwife, who now trembled when she walked. Isolde knew the signs. The eye of judgment was circling once more. She began to prepare, not to flee, for there was nowhere to run, but to preserve. Pages from the book were copied onto scraps of flax cloth, wrapped in oilskin, and hidden beneath stones near the riverbank. Herbs were dried and sewn into pouches with markings only Leonie would understand. Names of women who could be trusted, quiet healers, kind bakers, widows who remembered old songs, were whispered in the stillness of the early morning. Leonie, too, took on more. She began to treat bruises and splinters under her mother's watchful eye. She practiced grinding roots, boiling tinctures, memorizing the shapes of leaves and the timing of moons. Her hands, though young, moved with ancient precision. But as they prepared, so too did the others. One night, after the chapel bells had long ceased and only the owls kept watch, Father Ulrich met with the steward of the bishop in the shadow of the yew tree. Their voices were low, their gestures sharp. They did not know that Elias watched from the branches above, silent as a shadow. He would tell Leonie the next day what he heard, that another inquiry had begun, that a list had been made, that Isolde's name was on it, and her daughter's beside it. The sky was a low tapestry of gray when Elias brought word of the list. Clouds hung heavy over Elmwick, and the air tasted of iron and stillness. It was the kind of morning where even the birds held their songs, where dogs barked without reason, and the earth itself seemed to pause in dread. Isolde sat at the table with a spindle in her lap when Leonie entered, her eyes wide, her voice barely above a breath. "They've named us." The words fell like stones into water, rippling through the quiet of the room, shattering its fragile peace. Isolde looked up slowly, her fingers tightening around the thread she had been spinning. "Are you certain?" Leonie only nodded, and behind her, the doorway filled with Elias, his face pale but resolute. "I heard them. Father Ulrich and the steward. They're gathering names of women suspected of unsanctioned healing, of keeping relics or books outside the church's blessing." They spoke yours, Isolde, and Leonie's too. Isolde closed her eyes for a moment, as if drawing strength from the darkness behind her lids. The moment she had long expected had come, not with flames and cries, but with whispered meetings beneath trees, with parchment and ink, and the slow, deliberate turning of suspicion into judgment. She rose, her movements calm, almost reverent, and walked to the hearth. With practiced ease, she pulled back the stones that lined its base, revealing the hollow beneath. From it, she retrieved the book, her mother's legacy, and turned to face them both. "There is little time now," she said softly. "We must do what cannot be undone." Leonie and Elias watched as Isolde opened the worn cover and removed several folded scraps of parchment, stained and frayed. She handed one to her daughter, a map of sorts, inked with careful lines, showing paths through the woods that led not to towns or markets, but to places forgotten by men. "There are others," Isolde said, "women who fled when their names were called, who vanished into the old paths. This will lead you to one of them. Her name is Dagna. She will know who you are." Leonie's lips parted, and her voice cracked with sorrow. "You speak as though you are not coming." Isolde reached out, brushing a stray curl from her daughter's brow. "If I flee with you, they will not stop until we are found. But if I remain, if they believe they have the source, they may not look further. They will not see the seed planted in you." Tears welled in Leonie's eyes, but no sob escaped. She had learned already the weight of silence. "Tonight," Isolde continued, turning to Elias, "you must take her by the old path past the mill. It is watched only by the hounds, and they know your scent. You must move under cover of night when the moon is high. Do not light a torch. Do not speak unless you must." Elias nodded, his jaw clenched tight. "There are herbs you will carry," she said to Leonie, handing her a small leather pouch. "For wounds, for fever, for sleep, do not open it unless you must. And remember the prayers I taught you, not the ones in the chapel, but the ones in the old tongue. They are not spells. They are memory." They spent the day preparing in silence. Isolde cooked a small meal and made the preparations seem routine, though her hands trembled as she stirred. Leonie packed what little she could, a cloak, a flask, a carved comb from her childhood, and when the sun dipped below the hills and shadows stretched long across the fields, they stood in the doorway for the last time. "Promise me," Isolde said, voice trembling now, "that you will not stop learning, that you will pass it on, not in defiance, but in remembrance." "I promise," Leonie whispered. They embraced then, a long, quiet holding that felt like the turning of a page. When they parted, neither looked back. Isolde stood in the doorway, the wind lifting her braid, the stars beginning to blink open above her. And as her daughter and the boy disappeared into the velvet dark, she whispered a blessing only the trees could hear. She returned inside and sealed the hearth. In the chapel, the candles still burned. Father Ulrich prepared his sermon for the next day, one that would speak of obedience and the danger of wandering hearts. The steward sharpened his quill and studied the list once more, eyes narrowed. And in the woods, Leonie ran. Her feet were swift and silent, her breath steady. Elias kept close, guiding her with sure steps, his hand never far from hers. The map in her bodice pressed against her heart, and every rustle of leaves felt like a voice from the past urging her forward. As they crossed the stream near the mill, she paused, looking back just once to the faint glow of the village far behind. It seemed so small now, a candle flickering against the vastness of the night. She turned again and stepped into the forest, where the paths of women long forgotten waited to carry her forward. The forest welcomed them with shadows thick and deep, ancient and undisturbed. Each tree stood like a sentinel, cloaked in moss and memory, and the path beneath their feet twisted like the old stories, unmarked by hoof or wheel, trodden only by those who knew how to read its signs. Elias moved with care, guiding Leonie around gnarled roots and under low-hung branches, his hand steady against the small of her back. For the first hour they spoke not at all. The night was dense with sound, the low hoot of owls, the distant cry of a fox, the hush of leaves murmuring secrets only the wind understood. Leonie felt every heartbeat in her throat, every breath a prayer. Yet with each step, the fear that clutched her chest began to loosen, replaced by a strange and aching clarity. She was leaving behind not just her home, but the shape of her old life. Isolde had warned her of this, That flight was not only about escape, but transformation. The girl who passed through the trees would not be the same one who emerged beyond them. Something would be shed, left behind among the branches like an old skin. They came upon a clearing where moonlight spilled through the canopy in pale ribbons. Elias paused, tilting his head. "We should rest here for a moment," he whispered, his voice almost lost in the hush. "We're still far from the next rise." Leonie nodded and lowered herself onto a moss-covered stone, her limbs aching with fatigue and the weight of what had just begun. Elias crouched beside her, pulling a strip of dried meat from his satchel and offering her half. They ate in silence, the food dry and tasteless, yet comforting in its routine. "Will she be safe?" Elias asked at last, not looking at her, but at the path behind them. "My mother?" Leonie's voice was quiet, unsure. He nodded. "She knows how to endure." She replied, "She always has. But I do not think safety is what she chose." "What did she choose then?" "To be the wall that breaks the storm, so I could pass through it." Elias didn't respond. He only looked up at the stars filtering through the branches, and Leonie followed his gaze. The constellations were the same ones she had learned as a child, the shepherd's staff, the milkmare, the dancer's hand. But they seemed further away now, as if belonging to another world entirely. As they resumed their journey, the forest thickened. The path narrowed to little more than a game trail, and the night grew colder. Leonie pulled her cloak tighter and reached into her bodice for the map. Under the dim starlight, she traced the inked lines with her fingertip. "We should reach the old boundary stone before dawn," she murmured. "After that, it's another half-day's walk to Dagna's Hollow." "Do you think she'll take us in?" Elias asked. "She'll take me," Leonie said. "If she remembers the name Isolde." The name was a key, passed like a relic from one woman to another. In the world of men, it meant little, but among the wise women, the hidden ones, the quiet ones, it opened doors not made of wood or iron, but of trust. As they neared the stone, the trees began to change. The trunks grew wider, older, some twisted in unnatural ways as if shaped by wind or grief. Vines clung to them like veins, and the air held the scent of damp earth and time. Leonie paused, placing her hand on one of the trunks. "This place remembers," she said softly. "What do you mean?" "It's old. Older than Elmwick. Older than the church. The women who walked these woods, they left pieces of themselves behind. The stories don't forget." At last, they reached the boundary stone, an oblong monolith half swallowed by ivy, its surface carved with symbols that pulsed with a presence too deep for words. Leonie knelt before it, whispering something in the old tongue, a prayer her mother had taught her when she was barely old enough to speak. Elias watched, unsure whether to bow, to cross himself, or simply to remain still. When she rose, the woods seemed to shift slightly, the path ahead opening just a little more easily. "We're past the edge now," she said. They walked until the stars began to fade and the sky paled to the color of milk. Insects stirred in the underbrush, and dew settled on their cloaks. Leonie's feet ached, but she pressed on, guided by instinct as much as the map. By midday, they reached the glen. It was a quiet hollow tucked between two ridges, barely discernible from the surrounding woods. A stream trickled nearby, and wildflowers blanketed the ground like a woven quilt. At its center stood a cottage of stone and thatch, almost hidden beneath ivy and ash trees. Smoke rose from the chimney in a single steady plume. Leonie approached, heart pounding. She stepped to the threshold and raised her hand to knock, but before she could, the door creaked open. A woman stood there, her hair streaked with silver, her eyes sharp and gray as winter skies. "You have the eyes of Isolde," she said before Leonie could speak. Leonie bowed her head. "I am her daughter." The woman nodded slowly. "Then you'd best come in. The storm behind you has long teeth." And with that, Dagna stepped aside, and Leonie crossed the threshold into the world her mother had once whispered about. A world of hidden knowledge, of sisterhood beneath silence, and of survival woven not through power, but through remembrance. The interior of Dagna's cottage was dim, yet not unwelcoming. The single-room dwelling breathed with the scent of drying herbs and old wood, of smoke that clung gently to beams long blackened by countless winters. Glassless windows let in narrow shafts of light that danced along earthen walls adorned with bundles of rosemary, thyme, and wild mint. Everything within seemed to hum softly, like a lullaby remembered from infancy. a place alive with quiet purpose. Leonie stepped in first, followed closely by Elias, his eyes wide as he scanned the unfamiliar space. Though he had grown up near forges and the roar of fire, there was something more sacred here, more fragile. Dagna did not offer a greeting in words. Instead, she poured water from a clay jug into 2 cups and handed them silently to her guests. The water was cold and tasted faintly of wood sorrel. Leonie drank deeply, while Elias took small, cautious sips, unsure of the customs he had just entered. Dagna then turned, motioning Leonie to a bench near the hearth, where a pot simmered lowly over a smoldering log. "You've come far," she said at last, her voice a blend of smoke and wind. "And not for rest alone." Leonie nodded. "My mother, Isolde. She sent me to you." "I know," Dagna murmured, her eyes distant. "The old names return in their time. I knew your mother once before she bore you. We walked a similar road, she and I, though mine took me deeper into the woods. I left the village when they burned my sister." Elias shifted uncomfortably, lowering his gaze. Leonie reached for the pouch at her belt and retrieved the map, placing it on the table. "She said you could show me how to live, how to carry what she taught me." Dagna studied the young girl for a long moment, then reached for the parchment, her gnarled fingers tracing the lines. "This map is older than it looks," she said. "The paths drawn here were once used by the Whispering Circle, a chain of women who tended the sick and taught the secrets of the earth. They passed this knowledge through memory and dream, never in open ink. But your mother dared to write it down. Brave or desperate, perhaps both." "I will not forget," Leonie said. "No," Dagna agreed, "but remembering is not enough. You must learn how to weave memory into shadow, to move where no footsteps remain, to be unseen and yet everywhere." She turned then and reached into a chest near the wall, withdrawing a bundle wrapped in gray wool. Unfolding it on the table revealed tools not of war, but of healing. A mortar and pestle carved from riverstone, bone needles, dried roots tied with flax string, and small vials labeled in the old tongue. One vial contained dark liquid that shimmered like oil in candlelight. "These were my sisters," Dagna said softly. "They now pass to you." Leonie's hands trembled slightly as she touched the items, not from fear, but from reverence. Each object bore a history she could feel, a pulse of the past. Dagna moved about the room, gathering ingredients, preparing a poultice with the practiced ease of one who had done so in both light and secrecy. As she worked, she spoke not only with her mouth, but with her body, with gestures, with pauses, with the rhythm of grinding leaf into powder. "There are things you must learn now," she said. "Names of roots and signs in the sky. The time to harvest, the time to wait. Which wounds speak of fever and which of poison. Which births will turn and which must be turned. These lessons are old, but they will save lives, perhaps your own." The hours passed like leaves floating down a slow stream. Dagna taught her to prepare teas that calmed a restless soul, to find the pulse in the wrist, to listen not only to a woman's words but to the ache behind them. She spoke of dreams, how sometimes a woman's visions were not madness, but memory echoing from a life before. Elias watched, silent for much of it. Yet he fetched water, split wood, and helped as asked. Dagna noticed, and when the time came to rest, she nodded at him approvingly. "You have chosen well, Leonie," she said quietly. "He walks beside you, not ahead." That evening, as the sun dipped below the hills and dusk draped its cloak across the glen, they shared a meal of broth and foraged roots. They ate slowly, and after, Dagna sang in a tongue Leonie did not yet know, an old dialect that tasted of sea and stone. The song did not rise, it settled, like embers in the soul. Later, as the fire whispered low in the hearth and the crickets began their soft chorus, Leonie lay on a cot beside the door. Her thoughts churned slowly, of her mother, alone in Elmwick, of Father Ulrich's sermons, of the book beneath the hearthstone that might now be gone. She turned toward the ceiling where shadows danced. "Do you think they'll come looking for us?" Elias whispered from the floor beside her. "Yes," she answered, "but not yet. And when they do?" Leonie didn't answer immediately. She placed her hand over her heart where the map had rested. "When they come," she said at last, "they'll find the forest has grown deeper than they remember. And in that deep, I will be waiting." The fire crackled softly. Dagna snuffed the final candle. And outside, under the pale eye of the moon, The glen breathed with the rhythm of a world that had long hidden its daughters, keeping them safe, not in walls, but in whispers. The days that followed settled into a rhythm so ancient it felt carved into the bones of the land itself. Morning arrived in a veil of mist, curling low over the glen, and each dawn began not with command or duty, but with purpose. Dagna rose first, always, her silhouette already moving by the time the birds began their tentative songs. Leonie followed soon after, rubbing sleep from her eyes as she stepped barefoot onto the dewy floor, the earth beneath her a gentle whisper of welcome. The apprenticeship was not spoken of in such words, but that is what it was. Dagna did not teach as a scholar would. There were no lectures, no strict recitations. Instead, her knowledge flowed like the stream that ran beside the cottage, winding through task and story, through gesture and glance. Each day brought new understanding, but always quietly, like dawn chasing away the stars. They learned by doing. Dagna took Leonie into the woods to gather herbs, not merely naming them, but teaching their moods, their seasons, the times when one root would soothe and another might poison. "Every plant is a word," she said once, placing a sprig of feverfew into Leonie's hand. "But you must listen before you speak it." They dug burdock near the river's bend, harvested elderflower in the dry light of midday, and waded into the marsh for wild mint, whose leaves carried a song of cooling breath. Leonie recorded the signs not with ink, but with memory and touch, letting the knowledge settle into her skin, her fingertips, her breath. Elias was not idle. Though the glen seemed a world apart, he understood the necessity of caution. He reinforced the cottage's outer wall, repaired the roof with fresh thatch, and built a hidden storage in the root cellar. Dagna, though terse in praise, began to rely on him for things she no longer had the strength to do. In quiet hours, she would ask him about the forge, about the properties of iron, about the way heat bends metal and man alike. "Steel is strong," he once told her, "but it learns strength only through the fire." She had nodded, as if he'd recited a truth she'd known long ago. As summer matured, the glen became a sanctuary not only of safety, but of renewal. Leonie laughed more freely now, though never too loud. She moved with a grace her mother would have recognized, a gentleness balanced by a growing certainty. Her hands, once hesitant, now shaped poultices and bound wounds with the confidence of someone who knew both pain and its easing. And yet, the world outside the trees had not vanished. Dagna kept informed. Traders still passed near the glen, unaware of the cottage nestled in its green cradle. A woman in the next village over, pretending to trade goose feathers, left messages hidden in the hollow of a hawthorn tree. These messages came rarely, always in cipher, symbols carved onto birch bark, coated with moons and herbs. Dagna would read them in silence, her eyes flicking from rune to meaning. One such message came in late August, when the blackberries had ripened and the air began to carry the scent of hay. Dagna read it thrice before setting it down. "They've taken her?" she said without looking up. Leonie froze, the knife in her hand poised above a bundle of nettle. "Who?" she asked, though she already knew. "Your mother," Dagna said. The air in the room thinned. Leonie sat slowly, the nettle forgotten. "Where?" "They brought her to Whitevale, the bishop's stronghold." Dagna's voice was flat, but beneath it ran a current of anger too ancient to show openly. "The letter says she's been accused of heresy and consorting with forbidden knowledge." Leonie's breath came sharp and uneven. Her mother's face rose in her mind, not defiant, but composed, lips set in calm sorrow. "She stayed behind so I could run," Leonie whispered. "She did more than that," Dagna replied. "She gave them a shadow to chase, and now they believe they've caught the fire itself." A long silence passed, broken only by the rustle of leaves outside. Elias spoke first. "Can we help her?" Leonie did not look at him. Her gaze remained fixed on the bark message, on its cruel simplicity. "No," she said, "not in the way we want to. If we go, we give them exactly what they fear most, proof that she passed on the knowledge." Dagna folded the bark and tucked it into the fire. It curled, smoked, and vanished. "But there are other ways," she said quietly. That night, the three sat beneath the stars, each lost in their own sea of thought. Leonie braided mint and rosemary together into small charms, binding them with flax. Dagna traced runes into a circle of wax. Elias sharpened a small blade, though he did not know yet what it would need to cut. and in the trees beyond the glen, the wind shifted. The forest, ancient and slow, heard the sorrow in Leonie's breath, the quiet rage in her hands. It did not speak, but it listened. For it had always been the keeper of women's tears, of their secrets, their strength. Within that listening, something awakened. Leonie did not sleep. She stood at the edge of the clearing until dawn, watching the first light spill over the tops of the trees. Her mother was gone. But the knowledge lived, and through her, it would speak. Autumn crept into the glen like a patient hunter, soft-footed and cloaked in gold. Leaves turned slowly, their edges singed with ochre and flame, and the light thinned in a way that felt both sorrowful and serene. The glen, once vibrant with the pulse of summer, now whispered in hushed tones. The wind carried with it a crispness that hinted at what lay ahead. The world was preparing to sleep. But in the cottage, within those earthen walls, a different kind of awakening stirred. Leonie had not spoken of her mother again, not since the message was burned, not since her vigil beneath the stars. Something within her had crystallized. Not coldness, not grief alone, but a resolve quiet and vast as the forest itself. She moved through the days with the steady rhythm of one who knew her time was no longer her own. Each moment had a purpose, each task, a thread in the tapestry she was now weaving. Dagna, for her part, had begun to teach her more dangerous things, the herbs that numbed, that confused the mind, the roots that slowed a man's blood, the signs to look for in a body poisoned not by accident but by intention. It was not a descent into darkness. No, this was a preparation. For the world did not suffer wise women to walk unarmed, not in truth. Their weapons were not swords but silence, not arrows but remedies laced with consequence. You must know all paths, Dagna told her one evening as they ground black nightshade into a paste. The ones that heal and the ones that halt. Mercy is not always gentle. Leonie did not flinch. And justice? Dagna's eyes flickered, like the last gleam of firelight in a dying ember. Justice, she said, is a story we write ourselves, quietly, carefully. Elias had changed too. He spoke less, watched more. He had begun crafting items that no longer served only for labor. A concealed blade beneath a walking stick. A belt pouch lined with lead to shield vials from the sweep of iron detectors used by the bishop's men. He trained in silence, using the clearing near the stream as his ground. When Leonie watched him, she did not see a blacksmith's apprentice. She saw a guardian. Not of her alone, but of the knowledge they carried together. One morning, before the mist had fully lifted from the glen, Dagna gave Leonie a box. It was made of ash wood, small enough to cradle in her palms, bound with iron latches worn smooth by time. This belonged to Aldith, she said. She kept it hidden beneath a stone in the chapel ruins outside Westmere. It was never found. Leonie opened it slowly. Inside were scraps of parchment, fragments of letters, and 3 small vials sealed with wax. One held dried petals, another a fine gray powder, and the last a thin red oil that shimmered when touched by light. These are seeds of fire, Dagna said, figuratively and otherwise. Their use is rare, but when the need arises, they answer. Leonie did not ask what each one could do. She understood now that not all knowledge should be named aloud. Dagna placed a hand upon her shoulder. You are ready, she said. Not for battle, but for the path. What path? Leonie asked, her voice barely more than breath. The one that waits when the fire has passed, the path of return. That evening, as twilight painted the trees in copper and violet, Leonie went to the stream alone. She knelt, fingers tracing the surface of the water. A single leaf floated past, spinning slowly. She watched it disappear, then reached into her pouch and withdrew a charm woven of nettle and bone. She whispered her mother's name, not in mourning, but as a thread in the great weaving. Isolde, she said, and the trees seemed to bow. A sound behind her, Elias. She did not turn. They'll declare her trial in a fortnight, he said. The traders heard it on the road to Whitevale. Public, open. Leonie's fingers curled around the charm. They want to make a lesson of her, Elias continued, voice taut, to show that knowledge is a danger. She rose slowly, her eyes still on the stream. Then we must remind them, she said, that fire does not only consume, it spreads. The next day, they prepared to leave. Dagna gave her the book, her mother's book. She had preserved it, hidden in a box lined with beeswax and birch bark. It bore creases and stains, but its spine was intact. Its ink, though faded, still held power. You must walk into the world, Dagna said, not as a fugitive, but as a shadow, not as prey, but as memory. Go not to fight, go to be seen. Leonie understood. Whiteveil was a fortress, a seat of law, but also of fear. She would not storm its gates. She would walk among its people. She would speak not to its rulers, but to its wives, its daughters, its forgotten. Because stories moved faster than horses. Because sometimes the greatest weapon was the truth whispered in the wrong ear. And so, as the trees shed their leaves, as the world tilted toward the hush of winter, Leonie stepped from the glen, not as a girl fleeing a village, not as a healer in hiding, but as a story walking into the fire. The road to Whiteveil stretched long and uneven, winding like an old scar across the belly of the land. Beneath a sky of cold gray silk, Leonie and Elias moved like shadows between hedge and hollow, guided not by maps alone, but by the rhythm of memory and instinct. Autumn had painted the world in gold and rust, the trees shedding their last garlands as the wind whispered of approaching frost. The earth beneath them softened with fallen leaves, and the air, though scented with ripe apples and damp bark, carried a chill that hinted at the sleep of winter. They traveled only at dawn and dusk, seeking cover when the sun rode high. At midday, they found shelter beneath crumbling shepherd huts or in the thickets where deer beds lay empty. The towns they passed were quiet, watchful, the kind of places where the arrival of strangers stirred both curiosity and suspicion. But Leonie knew how to move without leaving footprints behind, her cloak drawn low, her gaze downcast, her hands folded as though in prayer. In one hamlet, she treated a child's fever with a brew of elderflower and chamomile. In another, she whispered a blessing over a pregnant woman, tracing a spiral on her belly with water touched by rue. They paid her in dried fish and barley, but more than coin passed in those exchanges. Eyes softened, doors opened, and the whisper of her journey moved ahead of her, passed from woman to woman like a thread in the old weaving. In the town of Greynook, 2 days from Whiteveil's eastern gate, they met Merlin, a woman with wrists strong from candle pouring and eyes too sharp for her age. She sold them lodging in her hayloft, and later, over a bowl of lentil stew, she spoke with her hands tight in her apron. "They've built a platform," she said, her voice low, "right in the cathedral square. Wood still green, so the smoke will last longer. They're calling it a cleansing." She glanced at Leonie, her mouth aline. "All Hallows Eve. That's when they'll do it." Leonie felt the words like a blade across her ribs. All Hallows Eve. 8 nights away. Marilyn continued, reaching into her apron pocket. "My grandmother was a midwife. She wore this when she labored through the plague winters. Said it kept her spirit steady." She placed the item into Leonie's hand, a small charm of holly and nettle, bound with flax and beeswax. Leonie clutched it tightly. "Your grandmother walked our path." Marilyn nodded once. "And I still know the tune." They left Greynook before dawn, slipping away through an overgrown orchard where frost glittered on the fruit like silver dust. The land became flatter, bleaker, the trees thinning as the walls of Whiteveil rose on the horizon, tall and pale as bone. The fortress city had been built to endure siege and shadow alike. Its towers loomed like watching eyes, and its stone was veined with centuries of ash and power. Elias kept close, his hand never far from the hilt of his knife. Though they traveled as pilgrims, there was tension in every step. When they reached the southern gate, they joined a line of merchants and farmers waiting to enter. No one looked twice at the brown-robed girl with a basket of herbs and a boy bearing skins and wool. They passed through unnoticed, swallowed by the city. Whiteveil was a city of thresholds, between sacred and profane, between wealth and waste. Cathedrals rose like cliffs, casting shadows over alleys that stank of fish and smoke. The cathedral square bustled with the fever of the harvest festival, its joy hollowed by the knowledge of what would soon be lit there. They took shelter in the tannery quarter, where Alice, a widow whose brother had once worked beside Elias, offered them a cot and a bowl of stew. Her hands were stained by dye and lye, but her heart held warmth. "There's talk," Alice said as they sat beside her hearth, "of a woman who healed without permission. They say she defied the bishop himself. Some say she spoke to the wind. Some say she sang in the old tongue." "She sang for her daughter," Leonie murmured, staring into the fire. The days passed in careful silence. Leonie listened more than she spoke, Slipping through markets and laundries, watching women, she offered her help discreetly, binding a wound here, easing a cough there, and in return she received looks, nods, touches on the arm that lingered a second too long. The whisper had come before her, and it was waiting. On the fifth day, as the sky dimmed with a storm's promise, she walked alone to the cathedral square. She stood at the edge of the crowd, hidden beneath her hood, and saw the platform they had built. Broad, cruel, and bound with iron rings, the place where her mother would be chained. The air around it tasted of fire not yet lit. She turned and walked away, her steps measured, her breath steady. That night, they met in secret. 5 women in a candlemaker's shop, the door barred behind them. No names were spoken, only glances, nods, the shared breath of those who had lived too long beneath silence. They listened as Leonie spoke, not with fire, but with memory. She told them not of vengeance, but of return, of light hidden, now burning again. They listened, and when she finished, one by one, they reached beneath their shawls and produced charms, herbs, scraps of old script, proof of a lineage too deep to name. The city did not yet know, but the fire it prepared would not consume. It would illuminate. Certainly. Here is part 21 of the story. The days were shortest when the hearth was coldest. In the fading twilight of an early winter eve, the wind curled like a serpent through the stone village, carrying with it the scent of smoke and damp wool. Within the low walls of a modest cottage near the edge of the woodlands, a woman named Elswith tended to her loom with hands cracked from frost, her breath fogging before her in the airless space. Her 2 daughters, Ethel and Merwin, sat near her feet, wrapped in a woolen blanket woven from last year's harvest of sheep's fleece. Their cheeks were chapped red, their small hands stiff as they tried to mend a worn linen shift, needle clutched like a tiny sword against the growing dark. Elswith had once danced barefoot in sunlit meadows when she was a girl, when her hair was golden as flax and her limbs knew nothing of ache. That girl had long been buried under years of toil and childbirth, of burying kin and kneading dough with fingers too weary to tremble. Now she was a widow at 32, considered old in her village, yet expected to labor from candle-wane to candle-wane as if she were a girl still. There was no mercy in widowhood, not in these lands. Without a husband to till the land or pay the tithe, Elswith found herself ensnared in the unwritten laws of men and clergy alike. Her land, once shared with her husband, had been claimed by her lord upon his death, for women could not own property unless it was explicitly written in their dowry, and hers, hastily scribbled by a drunken scribe years ago, held no such promise. She was allowed to remain, out of the Lord's benevolence, but her yields now belonged to him. She could glean the edges of her own field, but never harvest its bounty. And so she wove. Wool, flax, nettle, any thread she could harvest or barter, was turned into cloth by her tireless fingers. Weaving was woman's work, honorable yet invisible, and paid only in pence or bread, depending on the merchant's mood. Yet the rhythm of the loom was her only power left, a soft rebellion in threads. The cloths she made found their way into markets and manor houses alike, their beauty praised without name, without credit. Her hands gave warmth to strangers she would never meet, but her daughters? They were the flame she would not let be extinguished. Elswith taught them not just to stitch, but to observe. Merwin, the elder at 10, already questioned why boys could chase deer while she was tasked with dyeing yarn. Ethel, still bright-eyed at 7, whispered to the goats and gathered stories from old Ida, the healer who lived past the brook. Elswith watched them grow with a mixture of dread and wonder, knowing that soon the village eyes would turn toward them not as children, but as vessels for labor, for marriage, for men's claim. Each year, the reeve would pass through, cataloging the eligible maidens of the village for the tax rolls and the marital arrangements of the Lord's court. Girls as young as 12 could be betrothed, sold essentially, to men thrice their age, often in return for livestock or land favors. And once married, a girl's body ceased to be hers. Her thoughts, her womb, even her silence were expected to serve. Elswith's own marriage had not been cruel, but it had been hollow, dictated more by seasonal necessity than love. Her husband, Osric, was not unkind, but she had never known his laughter in the dark. Still, she missed him, his steadiness, his shoulder in the night, the shared glances across a silent supper. In his absence, the world seemed more jagged. She could not afford to miss him aloud, though. Grief was a luxury she had no time to feed. That winter, whispers began to stir of a new steward arriving, sent by the Baron to enforce debts more sternly. The village reeve, an old man with clouded eyes, had been deemed too lenient. The new man, it was said, came with a retinue and a hunger for tribute. Already, the miller's widow had been sent away for failing her tithe. No one spoke of where she had gone. No one dared ask. Elswith feared for her daughters. She feared that Merowyn's sharp tongue would provoke some noble's ire, or that Ethel's innocence would attract the wrong kind of interest. The church preached of womanly virtue, obedience, silence, piety, but the women knew the truth. No amount of prayer kept hands from wandering or taxes from rising. The priests themselves took liberties in the name of confession, their sins hidden beneath cassocks and incense. Yet even in fear, Elswith did not bend. Each night, after her daughters slept, she sat by the dying embers and sang old songs, ballads of women who turned into trees to escape hunters, or who led armies in secret behind veils. She sang softly, the tunes winding through the rafters like ghosts. Her songs were not just for comfort, but for memory, for resistance. And then came the morning when a horn sounded at the village edge. The new steward had arrived, cloaked in furs and surrounded by men with iron at their hips. He was young, far younger than the village expected, with dark eyes that flicked over each face like tally marks. He said little, but when he did, it was with the confidence of someone used to obedience. He called for every household to present its records, its debts, its tithes, its people. Elswith stood in line among the others, Merowyn's hand clenched in hers, Aethel tucked beneath her cloak. The steward's gaze paused on them, lingering just a moment too long. "What is your standing?" he asked, voice cold as the wind. "A widow," she replied, steady despite her trembling. "No debts unpaid." He smirked, then made a note on his parchment. Noted. That was all. But Elswith knew it was the beginning of something. That night, she did not sing. She listened instead, to the wolves howling beyond the woods, to the slow creak of timber, to her daughter's even breathing. And in that silence, she made a vow, not aloud, not written, but held in the marrow of her bones, that her daughters would not live invisible. Not like her, not like so many before her. The frost clung thicker to the thatch in the days that followed, and the cold seemed to grow heavier, not just in air, but in spirit. Elswith's village had grown quieter, more watchful since the steward's arrival. Where once gossip flowed like the river in spring, now whispers curled only in dark corners, behind shutters barred against both wind and men's notice. The rhythm of life continued. Meals were prepared, cloaks were mended, bread was baked, but all was done beneath a veil of dread, and each woman moved as though something unseen hunted them. Elswith woke before the sun, every morning. Her bones ached more sharply now, not just from labor, but from the creeping knowledge that time was drawing closer, time for decisions, for actions long postponed. She watched Merowyn and Ethel with the sharpness of a hawk guarding its fledglings. Her elder daughter had begun to bloom into womanhood, her limbs longer, her voice more resolute. Ethel, too, had changed in subtle ways. More questions, more wonderings about what lay beyond their hedge of brambles, beyond the road that curled toward the larger world. On the 5th morning after the steward's arrival, a notice was nailed to the village's central post. The villagers gathered, tight as sheep, as the steward's page read the decree aloud. All households to render account of able-bodied women above 12 winters. Service to the manor is now required of all who owe fealty, and selection for housework, craft, or courtly need shall be at the steward's discretion. It was phrased finely, wrapped in the trappings of duty and honor, but to the women, it was clear. The steward sought girls, whether for labor, for display, or for darker reasons, none could say, and none could refuse. Merowyn was 12. That night, Elswith sat with her elder daughter beside the hearth, the fire casting long shadows across their faces. She held Merowyn's hands, brushing her fingers over the small calluses earned from weaving and scraping hides. She studied her child's eyes, so wide still but no longer unknowing. "There are things," Elswith whispered, "that mothers carry but cannot pass, burdens shaped like choices." Merowyn said nothing, but her grip tightened. She understood in some deep, wordless way. "I will not let him take you," Elswith continued, more to herself than to her child. You are not a debt to be collected. The next day, she visited old Ida, the healer. Ida lived in the forest's edge, in a hut built from bark and smoke and years of solitude. She was half blind now, and the village spoke of her with caution. Some called her a witch, others a relic. But all knew she held the old knowledge, of herbs, of bones, of hidden paths. Elswith had brought her bread, wool, and a rare piece of honeycomb from their dwindling stores. She bowed her head low in greeting, and Ida, in her usual way, said nothing at first. But when Elswith spoke of the steward's demand and of Mirwen's coming of age, Ida nodded slowly. "There is a way," the old woman rasped, "but it will cost you." "Anything," Elswith breathed. And so a plan was sown in secret. Ida gave her a tincture, bitter, brown, and sharp-scented, crafted from elder bark and wolfsbane. It would dull fever and calm panic, she said, but it could also still the pulse if too much was taken. Elswith was not to use it unless there was no other choice. Alongside it, she handed over a bundle of herbs wrapped in deerskin, angelica, yarrow, and rue. "Bathe her in these," Ida instructed, "and speak no fear into the water. Only hope. The water remembers." In the days that followed, Elswith prepared. She taught her daughters how to run, where to hide, which trees bore edible bark, how to follow the moss to the north. She did not tell them why. She just told them to remember. Then the summons came. 3 names. 3 girls. Mirwen was among them. The steward's man arrived at dawn with a palfrey and a cart. Elswith stood at the threshold of her home, her daughter behind her. The wind bit her cheeks, but she did not flinch. "She's taken ill," she said flatly. "Fever. Bad lungs." The man sniffed the air as though illness had a scent. He peered past her into the shadowed house. "She'll be called again," he said, "if she lives." Elswith inclined her head. The door shut slowly after he left. That night, she held Mirwen close as the girl wept, not out of sorrow, but relief. They knew it was only a reprieve. But in this world, every delay was a victory. Elswith spent the hours that followed weaving a new cloak for her daughter. It was black, lined with warm fleece, and stitched with charms in the hem, symbols of protection, drawn from old stories. She whispered to the thread as she worked, prayers older than scripture, known only to mothers and widows. In time, she would send her daughters away, when the snow thawed and the rivers could carry them unseen. She had kin in a distant shire, distant enough to be safe. She would barter, beg, or bleed to see them there. Elswith no longer hoped to live free, but she burned with one last purpose, that her daughters would. And as the fire crackled low and frost painted silver on the window panes, Elswith watched the embers with tired eyes. The life of a medieval woman was carved from silence and submission, but in her silence, Elswith had kindled defiance. And though history would never speak her name, the blood of her quiet rebellion would flow through every stitch, every whisper, every girl who ran beyond the grasping hand.